The night Grace Talbot rode up to the wrong ranch, she was 30 miles off course, soaked to the bone from a storm that had turned the Texas panhandle into a black, roaring sea, and carrying a letter of introduction addressed to a dead man. The year was 1878, and the land between Amarillo and the Canadian River was not forgiving country. It swallowed the unprepared whole and spat nothing back. Grace had understood that in the abstract, the way a person understands danger from the safety of a parlor chair, reading newspaper accounts of frontier hardships while a fire crackled politely in the hearth. She understood it differently now, with mud caked up past her stirrups and her mare Clover trembling beneath her from cold and exhaustion, and the darkness pressing in so thick that she could not see her own hand if she held it at arm's length. She had left the small town of Hector, Kansas, 2 weeks prior. That was the beginning of all of it, or at least the beginning she could point to clearly. Her father had died in the spring, leaving behind a modest house, a modest debt, and a letter he had written himself addressed to one Harlan Webb of the Double Crown Ranch, Deaf Smith County, Texas. Her father had known Harlan Webb from the old days, from before Grace was born. From some chapter of his life he had never elaborated on except to say that Webb owed him a kindness and would not refuse a favor. The letter asked Webb to take Grace on as a housekeeper, to give her honest work and fair wages and a safe place to land until she could figure out what came next. Grace had not wanted to go. She was 24 years old, capable, and not without opinions about her own fate. But she was also alone, nearly penniless, and she had exactly 2 marketable skills in a world that measured women by very specific standards. She could cook better than most, and she could keep books with a precision that would have impressed a bank. Neither skill translated easily into independence in Hector, Kansas, where every position worth having had been held by the same women for 30 years and would not be vacated until death itself came knocking. So she had packed what she could carry, sold what she could not, and bought passage on a freight wagon heading south. 3 wagon changes, 1 missed connection, and a borrowed horse later. She was somewhere in the Texas panhandle in the middle of a black October storm, following a road that had ceased to be a road and was now simply a suggestion between 2 walls of grass. The light appeared first as a smudge, then as a gold square cut into the darkness. A window. Grace aimed Clover toward it with the single-minded determination of someone who has moved past the point of caring about propriety and arrived at the more primal calculation of survival. She would knock on any door in a storm like this. She would beg if she had to. The shape of the buildings came up slowly out of the rain. A ranch house, solid and square, with a covered porch. A large barn beyond it with the warm smell of horses drifting even through the rain. Fencing that looked well kept even in the dark, clean lines of it catching the faint light from the house. This was not a poor outfit. That registered somewhere in the back of her mind as she dismounted, her legs nearly buckling after so many hours in the saddle. She tied Clover to the hitching post and climbed the porch steps. Her boots made a hollow, exhausted sound on the wooden boards. She raised her fist and knocked. The door opened faster than she expected, as though someone had been near it, or awake and moving around the house at this late hour. The man who opened it was taller than she had expected from the modest scale of the porch, with dark hair that was a little long, curling slightly at the ends from the humidity, and sharp brown eyes that took her in from hat to boots with a quick, assessing look that held no malice, only the careful attention of a man who had learned to read situations fast. He was, she would calculate later, somewhere around 30. The lines at the corners of his eyes were earned ones, and there was a steadiness to him that did not come from youth. He wore no jacket, just a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the cold that was pouring in through the open door. "I need to see Harlan Webb," Grace said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was proud of that. The man's expression shifted just slightly. Something moved across his face that she could not name yet. "There is no Harlan Webb here," he said. Grace stared at him. The rain hammered the porch roof and ran off the edge in a solid curtain. "This is the Double Crown Ranch," she said. It was not a question. She had asked enough people along the road to be sure of that much. "It is," he said. "But Webb sold this property 4 years ago. I am Benjamin Trask. I have owned this place since the summer of '74. He paused, looking at her more carefully now, taking in the wet and the cold and the exhaustion she was not quite managing to hide. "What is your name?" "Grace Talbot," she said. "My father had an arrangement with Mr. Webb. I have a letter." She reached into her coat and produced it, the envelope soft and limp from the damp but still holding together. She held it out. Benjamin Trask took the letter, read the envelope, then looked back up at her. The rain had not let up. If anything, it had grown harder in the last minute, rattling against the porch roof with the sound of 1,000 impatient fingers. "You can stay," he said. Those 3 words landed simply, without elaboration, and Grace understood in the way that a person sometimes understands things without wanting to examine them too carefully, that he meant something more than just the night. But that understanding was too large to hold at the moment, so she set it aside. "Thank you," she said. "My horse needs the barn." "I will see to her," he said. "Come inside first." He stepped back and she walked in out of the rain. The interior of the ranch house was warm and spare and clean. A fire burned in a large stone hearth that dominated the main room. There was a table, heavy and practical, with 4 chairs. A bookshelf along one wall which surprised her. A braided rug on the plank floor, faded but well-maintained. The kitchen opened off the main room through a wide doorway, and she could see copper pots hanging on hooks above a large iron stove. The smell of the place was wood smoke and coffee and something that might have been pine soap. There was no woman's touch to it, she noted, not because it was neglected, but because its tidiness was functional rather than decorative. No curtains with any embroidery. No china displayed for beauty rather than use. This was a man's house, organized the way a man who valued order organized things, which meant nothing was out of place but nothing was soft either. "Sit down," Benjamin said, already moving toward the fireplace. He reached for a wool blanket that hung over one of the chairs and held it out to her. "I will make coffee when I come back in. The barn is just there. I will not be long." He took his coat from the hook beside the door and went back out into the rain without apparent complaint about it. Grace sat down. She peeled off her wet gloves and held her hands toward the fire. The warmth hit her like a physical thing, moving up through her fingers and into her wrists and climbing her arms slowly. She began to realize how cold she actually was, which was the kind of thing you only discovered once you started to thaw, because the cold had done a good job of convincing her she was managing. She sat there listening to the rain and the fire and the occasional creak of the house settling, and she thought about the fact that she was in the wrong place entirely. Harlan Webb was gone. The arrangement her father had made no longer existed. She had no claim on the hospitality of this man, Benjamin Trask, except the basic human claim of having appeared on his doorstep in a storm. In the morning she would have to figure out something else. She would have to ask him where the nearest town was and how far it was and whether there was work there. The door opened again and Benjamin came back in, rain dark on the shoulders of his coat, and she heard him hang it up without looking around. "Your mare is settled," he said. "She is a good horse." Was not hard to get her calmed down and eating. He came through to the kitchen and she heard him at the stove. "How long have you been riding tonight?" "Since mid-afternoon," Grace said. "I lost the road around sunset and did not find it again." "In this country that happens," he said, his voice carrying through from the kitchen with the easy-carrying quality of a voice used to open spaces. "The grass takes the road back every chance it gets. The locals know to watch for the fence lines instead." There was the sound of the coffee pot being filled. "Where were you coming from?" "A town called Firo," she said. "The man who sold me Clover said the Double Crown was a straight south ride from there." "It is in daylight," he said, "but Firo is 12 miles north, not 30. You came around." "The storm turned me." "It does that." He appeared in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame while the coffee heated. He was looking at her with that same careful, unhurried attention. Up close, and in the firelight, she could see that his face was angular and weathered but not unkind. There was something patient in his eyes that she had not noticed immediately in the doorway, a quality of waiting that was not passivity but something more like a man who had learned that most things worth understanding required you to stop rushing at them. "I am sorry about Webb," he said. "Do you know why your father sent you to him specifically?" "They knew each other before I was born," Grace said. "I do not know the full story of it. My father was not a man who told many stories." Benjamin nodded as though this made sense to him. "Webb was a decent man. He sold to me when his health went bad and moved back east to family. I have not heard from him since." He paused. "What was in the letter, if you do not mind my asking?" "An introduction and a request for work," Grace said. "Housekeeper, my father said Webb would honor it." "What kind of work can you do?" The question was direct but not rude. There was no implication in it beyond the practical. "I can cook and keep house," she said. "I can keep accounts. I can ride well enough clearly, even if my navigation leaves something to be desired." She said the last with a slight edge of dry humor that surprised her, considering how exhausted she was. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, almost. "I have no housekeeper," he said. "I have not had one since I bought the place. I have a cook who comes in for roundup weeks and 2 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse year-round. The house runs, however, I manage to run it around the actual work of the ranch." The coffee pot rattled. He disappeared back into the kitchen and returned a minute later with a tin cup that he held out to her. She took it and wrapped both hands around it. "I am not offering charity," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I am saying that if you want the work, it is here. Real work, fair wages. I can show you around in the morning and you can make up your mind." He looked at her steadily. "But tonight you stay regardless. I am not sending anyone back out in that." "I appreciate that," Grace said. She looked down at the coffee, then back up at him. "I will look at the situation in the morning and give you an honest answer." "That is all I would ask," he said. They sat with the fire between them and the storm outside, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were both tired in their bones and did not need to fill the air with sound to justify the company. "How many cattle do you run?" she asked eventually, because it seemed like something reasonable to ask and because she was curious. Her father had kept books for a grain operation in Hector, and she had grown up understanding that you could learn a great deal about a man from the way he managed his enterprise. 800 head right now," Benjamin said, "building toward 1,000. I have been buying carefully for 4 years, improving the bloodlines, trying to build something that will last rather than something that will produce quick and then fail." He said it without boasting, just as a statement of method. "There is a market in Dodge City that pays well for good beef. I drive in the fall." "You went this year. Came back 2 weeks ago," he said, "which is why there is no cook on the premises currently. She goes home to Firo between seasons." Grace drank her coffee. The warmth of it spread through her chest and settled something that had been coiled tight since mid-afternoon. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the hammering rain gentling into a steady pour. "You live here alone?" she asked. She was not sure why she asked it. It was perhaps too personal a question for a first conversation, but he answered it simply. "Yes," he said. "I have since my brother left. He ran the place with me for 2 years and then the wandering got him. He is in Colorado now, last I heard, mining or hunting or whatever the territory is offering." "Do you miss him?" "Every day," Benjamin said, without particular drama. "But it is his life to live." She slept that night in a room at the back of the house that turned out to be simply appointed but genuinely comfortable, with a bed that had a real mattress and 2 quilts and a washstand in the corner. She lay in the dark listening to the rain tapping more gently now on the window glass, and she thought about what happened next. She thought about the letter her father had written, addressed to a man who was no longer here. She thought about Benjamin Trask, who had opened his door in a storm without hesitation, and who had offered work without making it feel like pity. She thought about the fact that she was 24 years old and had nowhere else to go, and that perhaps that was not the disaster it felt like, but simply the shape of the thing that was going to determine what came next. She fell asleep before she reached any conclusions. Morning came blue and clear, the way Texas mornings often did after a night of hard weather, as though the sky had wrung itself out and was starting fresh. Grace woke to the sound of activity in the yard, boots on packed earth and the distant lowing of cattle, and the smell of wood smoke already rising from the kitchen. She dressed quickly in her cleanest remaining clothes from her travel bag, which was not saying much, and came out to find Benjamin already at the kitchen stove, moving with the competent but slightly mechanical efficiency of a man who could cook well enough to survive but had never learned to enjoy it. "Sit," he said without turning around. "There is bread from yesterday and I am making eggs." "I can do that," she said. "You are a guest this morning," he said. "Tomorrow you can decide if you are something else." It was a gracious thing to say. She sat at the table and watched him cook and noticed that his hands were very capable hands, large and sure-moving, the hands of someone who worked with them constantly. There were small scars on the backs of them, the everyday scars of ranch work, and the knuckles were slightly enlarged from cold and labor. He was not a soft man, but there was a gentleness in the way he handled even the ordinary objects of a kitchen, setting the pan down rather than dropping it, moving with an economy of motion that suggested awareness of the space around him. They ate breakfast, and then he showed her the ranch. The Double Crown was, Grace discovered in the full light of morning, a genuinely impressive piece of property. The main house was solid and well built, with a large covered porch that ran the full length of the front and looked out across a yard of hard-packed earth toward the barn and outbuildings. Beyond those, the land opened up into broad, gently rolling grassland, pale gold now with autumn, stretching out to meet a sky so blue and wide it seemed like an impossible thing, too large to be real. The barn was clean and well organized. 12 horses in their stalls, several of them clearly fine animals, well-fed and healthy. Benjamin introduced her to the 2 ranch hands, a man called Pete Aldridge who was grizzled and quiet and nodded at her without removing his hat, and a younger man named Domingo Reyes, who had grown up in this part of Texas and spoke with the easy bilingual fluency of the border region, switching between English and Spanish in the same sentence without appearing to notice he was doing it. Domingo was perhaps 26 and had a cheerful openness about him that made Grace like him immediately. "Miss Talbot," Domingo said, with a slight bow of his head that was courteous rather than exaggerated. "Are you staying, then?" "That is being decided today," she said. "Good country," he said simply. "You will like it." The house itself she walked through more carefully in the daylight. It had 5 rooms, including the kitchen, a root cellar accessible from the kitchen, a well in the yard that Benjamin told her had never gone dry even in the droughts of 76 and 77, which had been hard years for this part of the territory. A kitchen garden behind the house that had been put to bed for the winter but whose raised beds showed evidence of real productivity. "The woman who cooks during Roundup," Benjamin said, standing in the kitchen garden with her. "Her name is Mrs. Arrieta. She planted that garden when she first came years ago. She tends it when she is here. But the rest of the time it sits." He looked at it with a slight furrow between his brows that suggested he was aware of the waste of a good garden going only half-tended. "I garden," Grace said. "My mother did before she died. She taught me." "How long ago was that?" 12 years. I was 12. She said it plainly, without inviting sympathy, which was the way she had learned to say it. He looked at her with a briefly different quality of attention, as though he was adjusting some internal understanding. "I lost my father at 16, he said. "My mother when I was 21. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry too," he said, meaning her mother, and she believed he meant it. She told him she would take the position that afternoon, standing in the yard with the big October sky overhead and the smell of grass and cold coming in on the wind. He named a wage that was fair, genuinely fair, and she did not negotiate it down out of false modesty nor up out of greed. She simply said that she accepted, and they shook hands on it, his hand large and warm around hers for the moment it lasted. She wrote a letter that evening to Mrs. Clara Howell in Hector, Kansas, who was the closest thing she had to a friend back there, and told her where she had landed and that she was well and working. She did not tell Clara the full particulars of the arrival, the storm, the wrong ranch, the name nobody had recognized, because she was not sure yet how to characterize it. It felt too new and too unresolved to frame clearly. She would write again later when she had more distance on it. The first weeks settled into a rhythm. Grace was a worker by nature, not by performance, and the house came alive under her attention in ways that she suspected pleased Benjamin, even though he said little about it directly. The windows got washed until they let in the full force of the Texas light. The kitchen shelves were reorganized so that everything had a logical place and could be found without searching. She made bread 3 times a week, real bread with a thick crust, and the smell of it in the mornings became something she began to think of as the smell of her new life taking shape. Benjamin was out of the house most of the day. Ranch work in October was preparation work, checking fences before winter, managing the herd, hauling feed and hay into storage. He came in for dinner at midday and for supper in the evening, and these meals became the natural places where they talked. Not about large things at first, about practical things. The state of the north fence line, which needed repair before the first hard freeze. A dispute about land use with a neighboring outfit called the Harker Spread, which had been slowly encroaching on the Double Crown's eastern grazing allotment for 2 years, and which Benjamin was managing through the courts rather than through confrontation, because he believed in the law, and also because he was smart enough to know that confrontations on the frontier tended to cost more than they settled. The price of cattle in Dodge City this past season, the likelihood of a hard winter, then, gradually, about less practical things. He asked her about Kansas, and she told him about the flatness of it, the way the wind came across the plains with nothing to stop it, the way the small towns existed in a perpetual state of making do. He told her about how he had come to Texas, which was a story about a young man with $50 and a stubborn belief that the land in the Panhandle was undervalued, a belief that had turned out to be correct. He had bought his first 200 acres at a price that made other men think he was foolish and had built outward from there. "Were you afraid?" she asked one evening. They were sitting at the table after supper, the dishes cleared away, a lamp between them. She had developed the habit of staying at the table after eating rather than retreating immediately, because the evenings were long and the house was comfortable and his company had become, she realized, something she genuinely looked forward to. "Every day for the first 2 years," he said. "Not the kind of afraid that stops you, the kind that walks alongside you and reminds you what is at stake." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I think that kind of afraid is useful. It keeps you honest about what you do not know." "My father was afraid of everything and it stopped him completely," she said. She had not intended to say that. It came out as truth sometimes did, faster than intention. Benjamin looked at her without judgment. "That is a hard thing to watch," he said. "It was," she said. And then, because he was listening in the way that made it possible to say more, she told him about her father, about the man he had been in her early childhood, capable and warm and full of plans, and the man he had become after her mother died, as though grief had taken something structural out of him, and he had never found what to put back in its place. About the slow shrinking of his world until it was just the house in Hector, and the debts, and the letter he had written to a man named Harlan Webb as his final act of trying to take care of her. "He loved you," Benjamin said when she had finished. "I know," she said. "That was never in question. He just did not know how to be in the world after she was gone." She looked at the lamp. "I think some people are like that. Their whole world is one person, and when that person is gone there is no second way to orient themselves." "What is your second way?" Benjamin asked. "What do you orient yourself by when the people are gone?" It was a surprisingly intimate question. She looked at him. He was watching her with that patient, earnest attention she had come to recognize as simply the way he paid attention when something mattered to him. "Work," she said, "and learning things. And trying to see clearly. Those are mine." She paused. "What are yours?" "This land," he said, "the actual ground under this ranch, and the idea that if you build something carefully enough, honestly enough, it will stand." He paused too. "My brother used to say I had replaced religion with ranch management, which was an unkind way of putting it, but not entirely wrong." She laughed. It was the first real, unguarded laugh she had produced in months, maybe longer, and the sound of it surprised her, and seemed to surprise him too. He was smiling by the time the laugh ended, a genuine smile that changed his whole face, softened the angular lines of it, made him look younger and more open. "Your brother sounds like someone worth knowing," she said. "He is," Benjamin said. "He is irritating and frequently wrong about his own priorities, but he is worth knowing." November arrived and turned the grassland amber and gray. The first frost came on a Tuesday, and Grace woke to find the kitchen window decorated with ice crystals and the pump in the yard frozen, which Benjamin had anticipated and had already dealt with by the time she came outside, wrapping it in burlap the night before. He was always a step ahead of the weather in this way, reading the sky and the wind with the fluency of a man who had learned to treat the landscape as the primary text of his life. She started wearing his spare coat when she worked in the yard, a heavy canvas coat that was too large for her and smelled of wood smoke and horses. He had offered it without ceremony one morning when he noticed her shivering over the kindling pile, and she had taken it with the same ease with which it was given. She was aware that this was a small intimacy, wearing a man's coat, and she was also aware that she did not mind it. The Harker matter came to a head in November. She heard about it from Domingo first, who came in one mid-morning looking tightened around the eyes, and told her that 3 of the Harker outfit's men had been pushing double-crown cattle off the eastern pasture again, and that Pete was out there holding the line. Benjamin came in at noon with mud on his boots and a controlled kind of anger in his posture that she had not seen before. He sat at the table and she put food in front of him, and he told her what had happened with the specific, unflinching account of a man who would not dramatize, but also would not minimize. 2 years of this, he said. The court in Amarillo has the paper filed, but these things take until they take, and in the meantime Harker just keeps pushing. He knows I will not fight him on the ground. He is counting on patience to run out. But yours will not, she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. No, he said. It will not, but it is costly either way. Every week the cattle are off that pasture, they are on this one, and this one will be grazed out by spring. What did the paper in Amarillo say when you filed it? That the matter would be heard in the January term, he said, 3 months away. What is your documentation like? She asked. He looked at her with a particular attention. What do you mean? Your proof of boundary, your purchase records, the surveys. She leaned forward slightly. My father kept books for the grain cooperative in Hector for 15 years. I kept them alongside him from the time I was 14. I know what legal documentation looks like when it is airtight and when it has gaps. If you have gaps, they need to be filled before January. Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Then he got up from the table, went to a shelf in the main room, and came back with a wooden box that he set in front of her. That is everything I have, he said. The purchase agreement, the survey notes, 4 years of correspondence with the county clerk. Grace opened the box. She spent the rest of the afternoon at the table while he went back out, going through every paper in that box with the systematic attention of someone who had grown up, understanding that the truth of any situation lived in the details. By the time evening came, she had laid it out clearly. The purchase agreement was solid. The survey notes were partially solid, but had one section where the language was ambiguous about a creek as a boundary marker, the kind of ambiguity a clever lawyer could exploit. She wrote up a summary of what she found and left it on the table. Benjamin read it after supper. He read it twice, slowly. Then he looked up at her. This is very good work, he said. The Creek language needs to be clarified, she said. You need a sworn affidavit from the surveyor if he is still living, or a new survey of that specific section, before January. The surveyor is a man named Alcott out of Amarillo, he said. He was looking at her with a new quality of attention, something more than the careful appraisal of the first night but less than what it would become, something in between that was still finding its name. I will write to him this week. I can write the letter if you like, she said. I know how to phrase these things. I would like that, he said. And then, simply and directly, you are remarkable, Grace Talbot. She felt the warmth of that land somewhere just below her sternum. She did not look away from it and she did not deflect it. She just let it be what it was. I have useful skills, she said. That is not the same thing as remarkable. I know the difference, he said. She wrote the letter to the surveyor Alcott the following day, clear and precise and formal, setting out exactly what was needed and why and by what date. Benjamin read it and signed it, and she sent it out with Domingo, who was heading to Firo for supplies. December settled in with a cold that was not brutal but was serious, the kind of cold that required respect. Grace learned the rhythms of a winter ranch, the constant battle against frozen water and the need to check on the cattle daily, the particular loneliness of it, but also its particular beauty. The grassland under frost in the early morning was a thing of harsh grandeur, all pale silver and silence, and the sky in winter was a different color than in autumn, higher and bluer and impossibly clean. She and Benjamin had fallen into an easiness with each other by December that had no particular name, but was unmistakable in its quality. They had long evenings now, the dark coming early, and they filled them with conversation and occasional silences that were comfortable in a way that neither of them remarked upon, because to remark on it would have been to change it. He was reading his way through a set of Dickens novels that he had acquired at some point, and never got through during the busy seasons. She borrowed one, Oliver Twist, and they ended up discussing it over several evenings with a shared investment in the characters that kept surprising her. He had opinions about novels, precise and well-reasoned opinions, which was not what she had expected from a cattle rancher in the Texas Panhandle. "You are not what I expected," she said one evening, and realized as she said it that she was saying the quiet part out loud. "What did you expect?" he asked with genuine curiosity. "Less books," she said, "more certainty about everything, less listening." He considered this. "I grew up in a house where my father was certain about everything," he said. "It made me want to understand things before deciding about them." He paused. "What I did not expect was you." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when a woman appears on my porch in a rainstorm with a letter for a man who has been gone 4 years, I do not expect to be having this conversation 2 months later." He said it looking at the fire, then turned to look at her. "I am glad of it. That is what I mean." Her heart did a very specific thing in her chest that she was entirely aware of, and equally aware that she was not ready to name yet. "I am glad of it too," she said. Alcott the surveyor responded in December, just before Christmas. He was in fact still living and practicing in Amarillo, and was willing to provide a sworn affidavit clarifying the boundary language. He would need to ride out in the spring to do a proper confirmation survey, but he would provide a preliminary affidavit based on his original notes for the January term. Grace read the letter and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem being properly addressed. She showed it to Benjamin, and he read it with the same contained, steady pleasure with which he received good news, which was not loud or demonstrative but was entirely real. "You did that," he said. "We did it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was specific and clear, and she looked back at it with a steadiness she had not known she had until this territory had been teaching it to her for 2 months. Christmas came quietly. Grace cooked a real meal, roasted a chicken she had bought in Firo, made 2 pies, a dried apple pie and one with the preserved plums she had found in the root cellar from last summer's canning. She and Benjamin and Pete and Domingo ate together at the big table, and Domingo produced a bottle of rye whiskey that Pete received with visible gratitude. It was the most people the house had held since Grace had arrived, and the noise and warmth of it settled over the rooms like something that had been missing without anyone knowing it. After Pete and Domingo had gone back to the bunkhouse, Grace and Benjamin sat by the fire with the last of the pie in a quiet that was different from the ordinary evenings, warmer and more particular. "My brother and I used to spend Christmas at our mother's table in Missouri," Benjamin said. "She made a pork roast every year. I have not had a Christmas table since she died." "I am glad we had one today," Grace said. "So am I," he said. He looked at her with a directness that was new, or perhaps not new but more resolved. "Grace." "Yes," she said. "I want to say something, and I want to say it straight," he said, "because I am not a man who manages the crooked approach well." "Say it straight, then," she said. Her voice was steady. Her heart was not entirely. "I have been in love with you for about 6 weeks," he said. "I have not said it because I did not want to put you in an uncomfortable position, given the circumstances. You came here to work and you did not come here to have a man make declarations at you. But I am saying it now because not saying it has started to feel dishonest, and I have a strong objection to dishonesty." The fire crackled. The wind moved against the windows. Grace Talbot sat with this declaration for a moment and felt it settle into the space inside her where she had been keeping the unnamed thing for 6 weeks. "I have been in love with you for about the same amount of time," she said. "I have not said it because I was not sure yet whether I trusted it or whether I was simply lonely and you were simply kind." "And now?" he asked. "I trust it," she said. "You are kind, but that is not the same as why I love you. I love you because you are honest and careful and patient, and you have opinions about Dickens, and because you shook my hand when we made our agreement like I was a man worth shaking hands with, and because you have never once made me feel that being here was a charity case." She paused. "And because every morning when I hear you in the yard I am glad you are there." He got up from his chair and crossed the small space between them and sat down beside her on the settee, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. He did not reach for her immediately. He just looked at her with all that patient attention as though he was making sure. Then he took her hand, the same hand he had shaken 2 months ago in the yard, and held it with a care that was the opposite of casual. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your agreement." "You have my agreement," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a formal gesture that was also the most tender thing. And then he sat there holding her hand in the firelight, and she leaned her head slightly against his shoulder, and they stayed that way while the fire burned down, neither of them needing to say anything more because everything had already been said with exactly the right amount of honesty. January came, and the court date approached. Benjamin rode to Amarillo with the box of documents and the affidavit from Alcott and the careful summary Grace had prepared, which had by now been polished and expanded into something that laid out the boundary dispute with the clarity of a legal brief. She had used her best handwriting and organized it with the precision of someone who understood that the presentation of information was itself an argument. She watched him ride out with Pete and Domingo, who went as witnesses, and spent the day in the house with a particular quality of restlessness that she recognized as the new vulnerability of caring about the outcome of someone else's fight. She had a stake in it now that was personal. She made bread, and then she reorganized the kitchen store, and then she read 20 pages of Bleak House, which Benjamin had moved on to, and found she could not concentrate, and gave up and sat on the porch in the January cold and watched the road. They came back that evening. Domingo was grinning from 50 yards away, which told her everything before Benjamin had even dismounted. Harker's surveyor could not contradict Alcott's affidavit, Benjamin said, coming up the porch steps. His face was controlled, but his eyes were bright. "The judge ruled in our favor. The eastern pasture is confirmed double crown. Harker has 30 days to move any improvements off the disputed line." Grace stood up from the porch chair, and he came up the last 2 steps, and she put her arms around him without thinking about it, and he wrapped his around her with the same spontaneity, and they stood there on the cold January porch with the victory between them. "You did that," he said against her hair. "I already told you," she said. "We did it." He laughed, a genuine and full laugh, and the sound of it on that cold porch in that wide, empty country was one of the finest things she had ever heard. The courtship was, given the realities of winter ranch life, a somewhat unconventional one. There were no parlor visits or chaperoned carriage rides. What there was instead was the deep familiarity of shared daily life, given a new layer of intention, a consciousness between them of what it was building toward. He began picking up small things for her when he went to Firo or Amarillo, once a book she had mentioned, once a bolt of good blue wool fabric that she had said was hard to find in the local supply. She began cooking the things she knew he especially liked. A beef stew with dried chilies that Domingo had shown her the method for, a particular kind of cornbread that he had mentioned his mother made. They rode together on Sunday afternoons when the week's work allowed it, just the two of them out into the grassland, which was beautiful in its way even in the dead of winter, dramatic and austere, the sky enormous and the land answering it with its own horizontal enormity. She was learning to read the land the way he did, to see the small signs of it, where the good grass grew and where it was thin, which draws had water in them and which were dry, the way the clouds moved against the terrain. He proposed to her in February, on a Sunday afternoon, standing beside a frozen creek on the eastern edge of the property, the very boundary that Alcott had clarified. He did it simply and directly, the same way he did everything, which was to say he looked at her and said that he wanted to marry her if she would have him, and that he had been more certain of this than he had been of much in his life, and that he understood if she needed time to be sure. She told him she did not need time. She told him she had been sure since Christmas and had been waiting for him to be ready to say it. He pulled her close and kissed her for the first time there beside the frozen creek, and it was a cold day and the sky was slate gray, and it was the most warmly she had ever felt anywhere. They were married in April. It was a small wedding because they were far from the places where their former lives had been, and because neither of them wanted anything elaborate. The minister came out from Firo, a Methodist preacher named Reverend Cass who had a dry sense of humor and was visibly charmed by the situation. Pete and Domingo stood witness. Mrs. Arrieta, the cook, arrived for the spring season and threw herself into the preparation of a wedding supper with an enthusiasm that was clearly long pent up, as she had been telling Benjamin for 2 years that the house needed a proper mistress, a position he had not understood himself to be in need of until October. Grace wore her best dress, which was blue, and she carried a spray of the first wildflowers to come up along the creek, yellow and small and tough, the way all early spring things were in this country. Benjamin wore his Sunday coat and a new shirt and looked at her as she came out of the house and across the yard with an expression on his face that said everything without saying anything. Reverend Cass read the words. They said the words back. Benjamin put a ring on her finger that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band, and she had told him when he showed it to her beforehand that she would not want anything different. Mrs. Arrieta had made enchiladas and rice and beans and a cake that was wildly ambitious for a ranch kitchen and turned out nearly perfect. And Domingo played a guitar that no one had known he possessed, and Pete drank steadily and good-naturedly and said almost nothing, which was his highest expression of contentment. Grace stood in the yard in the April evening after supper, looking out at the grassland going gold in the late light, and Benjamin came and stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind, his chin resting near her temple. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "You arrived at the wrong ranch," he said, "in a rainstorm, asking for a man who has been gone 4 years." "I did," she said. "Best mistake anyone ever made," he said. She turned in his arms and looked at him. "I am starting to think it was not a mistake at all," she said. "I am starting to think it was exactly where I was supposed to go." He kissed her, and the April wind moved through the grass around them with the sound of something settling into place. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that teaches you what you are made of and what the person next to you is made of. The spring roundup was large. Benjamin had the biggest herd he had run yet, and the work of it was consuming and loud and relentless. Grace ran the house during roundup with Mrs. Arietta, the two of them feeding the extra hands that came on for the season and managing the daily logistics of the operation, with an efficiency that Benjamin told Grace afterward had made the whole thing run more smoothly than any previous year. She had also, by spring, taken over the ranch's bookkeeping completely. It had happened gradually and then entirely, beginning with the Harker documentation and extending outward as she demonstrated consistently that she understood not just how to record figures but how to analyze them, how to see in the numbers the story of what was working and what was not. Benjamin handed her the ledger in April and never asked for it back. In June she discovered she was pregnant. She told Benjamin on a morning in early June when the grass was at its fullest and the light came over the horizon like something being poured, golden and absolute. He stood in the kitchen with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth and looked at her, and then set the cup down very carefully and came across the kitchen and held her with both arms wrapped entirely around her and his face pressed against the top of her head. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. "I am more than well." "Good," he said. His voice was slightly rough. "Good, Mrs. Arietta, when she was told, produced a sound that was somewhere between a cry and a shout, and grabbed Grace's hands, and talked rapidly in a mixture of English and Spanish about what needed to be prepared and what she would make and what the baby would need, and Grace let her talk and smiled at all of it. The pregnancy moved through summer and fall. Grace worked right through it, because she was not sick and she was not weak and there was work to be done, though Benjamin fussed over her in the way of a man who loved someone and was frightened by the things he could not control, suggesting she rest when she showed no signs of needing it, and appearing frequently in the kitchen doorway with an expression of barely concealed anxiety that she found deeply endearing. "I am having a child, not an illness," she told him in August. "I am aware of that," he said. "Then stop looking at me like I might break." "I am looking at you," he said, "because you are my wife and you are carrying our child, and I look at you constantly regardless of circumstances, and the circumstances you are currently in are additionally remarkable." She could not argue with that. The baby came in February, on a cold, clear night with the stars out in their winter extravagance over the panhandle. It was a long labor, long enough that Benjamin's anxiety reached a quiet, contained peak that only Domingo, who had grown up with many siblings, and Mrs. Arietta, who had 6 children of her own and had assisted at many births, were able to manage by the simple expedient of keeping him busy and out of the room. The baby was a boy. He came into the world in the hour before dawn and announced himself with the kind of voice that suggested he was going to be loud and definite about his preferences. Grace held him in the early morning light and looked at his round, startled, furious face, and felt something open inside her that she had not known was closed. Benjamin came in when Mrs. Arietta allowed it, which was immediately after the baby arrived and was declared healthy, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that Grace would remember for the rest of her life, an expression so unguarded and so complete in its feeling that it was like looking at the man all the way through without anything held back. "He looks angry," Benjamin said. "He has opinions," Grace said. "I think he takes after you." Benjamin looked at her then, from his son to his wife, and the expression did not change in its fundamental quality, only widened to include everything in the room. They named him James for Benjamin's father, with the middle name Henry for Grace's father. James Henry Trask, who arrived with opinions and a voice to express them, and who became within the first week of his life the organizing principle of everyone at the Double Crown Ranch. Pete, who had said almost nothing to Grace in 5 months, arrived at the house the morning after the birth, hat in hand, with an expression that was as close to tender as his weathered face appeared capable of managing, and asked if he could see the boy. Mrs. Arrieta let him in, and he stood over the small cradle that Benjamin had built in November and looked at James for a long time. "Good," was what he said finally, and then he nodded and left. Domingo held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had held many infants and talked to him in a soft mixture of English and Spanish, and told him very seriously that this was good country, and he was going to like it here. James grew. He was a dark-eyed, sturdy baby who became a dark-eyed, sturdy small boy with his father's directness and his mother's love of having things make sense. He followed Benjamin around the yard from the time he could walk, which was early, and he followed Grace around the kitchen with the same attachment, and he sat on the fence watching the horses with the concentrated interest of a child who has already decided something important. The Double Crown continued to grow. Benjamin drove a very fine herd to Dodge City in the fall of their second year of marriage and came back with the best return he had ever had. He sat down with Grace and the ledger that evening, and they went through the numbers together, which was how they made every major decision, sitting at the table with the lamp between them and the land spread out quiet beyond the windows. The spring after James turned 2, Grace's old friend Clara Howell came to visit from Hector, Kansas, traveling with her husband on a wagon journey to see family in New Mexico. They stayed a week, and it was the first time Grace had seen anyone from her before life since coming to Texas, and the experience of it was stranger and sweeter than she had anticipated, the two worlds sitting side by side for a week and getting acquainted. Clara looked at the ranch and at Benjamin and at James toddling around the yard and at the life Grace had built here, and on the last evening before she left she sat with Grace on the porch and said, "You are happy." "I am," Grace said. "Genuinely, truly happy," Clara said, as though she wanted to be sure she was reading it right. "Yes," Grace said, "I am. I worried about you," Clara said. "When you left, you had nothing and nowhere to go and you were going into country you did not know." "I know," Grace said, "and you ended up here." Clara gestured at the wide evening, the grassland, the solid ranch house, the distant sound of Benjamin and Domingo working on something in the barn. "I got lost in a storm," Grace said. "I rode up to the wrong ranch in the dark. I knocked on a door and asked for a man who had not been here in 4 years, and the man who opened the door said I could stay." She looked out at the evening. "And it turned out he meant longer than one night." Clara shook her head slowly. "Some people have the most extraordinary luck," she said. "I do not think it was luck," Grace said. "I think it was being willing to knock on a door in the dark, even the wrong door, especially the wrong door." The 3rd year of their marriage brought more changes to the territory around them. The railroads were pushing further into the Panhandle, which meant better prices for cattle, but also meant more settlers coming in, the old open range giving way slowly to fencing and homesteads, and the complicated social fabric of a territory becoming something more settled. Benjamin followed these developments with careful attention, adapting his operation where necessary and holding his ground where possible. There were also larger forces at work in the territory that Grace could not ignore. The ongoing dispossession of the Comanche bands from the Panhandle that had been happening for years, the violence of it, and the injustice of it sitting in her awareness as a persistent weight. She had learned the history of this land from Domingo, who had a clear-eyed understanding of what had been taken and from whom, and from Benjamin, who spoke about it with the honest discomfort of a man who benefited from something he had not chosen but could not pretend did not exist. "This land was not empty when the ranchers came," he said to her one evening. "The people who were here had been here for generations. What was done to them was not right, and my sitting on this land and calling it mine does not change that history." "No," she said, "it does not. I do not know what the right answer is," he said, "except to be honest about it and not to add to the harm." She had been teaching James, from the time he was old enough to understand simple things, the actual history of the country they lived in. Not a heroic story with easy conclusions, but the full complicated truth of it as best they understood it. She thought this was what she owed him, and what was owed to the land itself. The summer James was 3. A letter arrived from Benjamin's brother Daniel in Colorado. It had the slightly breathless quality of Daniel's personality as Benjamin had described it, full of energy and news, and the kind of expansive optimism that covered the fact that the writer had been in 6 different places in 3 years and was currently trying to decide between a 7th and an 8th. He was coming to visit. He would be there in September. Grace had been curious about Daniel Trask for over 2 years, and the reality of him, when his horse came into the yard on a bright September morning, did not disappoint. He was Benjamin's height but lighter built, with the same dark hair and a face that had his brother's structure but configured for easy expression, where Benjamin's was configured for careful concealment. He was 27 and had the particular energy of a person who had been too many places too fast and was finally slowing down enough to feel the accumulation. He dismounted and Benjamin came out of the barn, and the 2 men stood in the yard looking at each other for a moment before Benjamin said, "You look thin," and Daniel said, "You look married," and then they embraced with the brief, tight ferocity of brothers who had missed each other without saying so. Daniel stayed 3 months. He was, as advertised, both irritating and worth knowing. He talked too much and had strong opinions about things he knew only superficially, and he was also quick and funny and genuinely kind to James in a way that made James adore him almost immediately. He was good with horses and willing to work, and he and Pete found an unlikely companionship in their shared taciturnity that expressed itself as sitting side by side on the fence at the end of the day, saying essentially nothing, and appearing to both find this adequate. He told Grace at some point in October that he had been skeptical, initially, when Benjamin's letters had begun to change in tone in late 1878. He had been skeptical that any woman could be what those letters implied she was. And now, Grace said, "You are exactly what the letters implied," he said, "and the letters, for the record, were very good." "What did he say?" she asked. Daniel smiled, a version of his brother's smile that was more immediately visible. He said he had met someone who looked at the world straight on and saw it clearly and was not afraid of what she saw. He said she was the smartest person in a room most of the time and did not make anyone else feel bad about it. Daniel paused. He said she laughed, and it was like a room getting lit up. Grace looked at her hands and felt the warmth of that move through her. "He told you all that in a letter," she said. "He told me all that in several letters," Daniel said. "My brother does not say small things. When he says something, it is the whole of it." "I know," she said. "That is one of the reasons." Daniel went back to Colorado in December with what appeared to be genuine reluctance. He and Benjamin said goodbye with the same brevity and the same ferocity, and he told Grace that he would be back, and she believed him. She was pregnant again by November of that year. The second baby came the following August, in the summer heat, and was a girl with Grace's coloring and Benjamin's stubborn expression, who arrived less dramatically than James had but with equal conviction. They named her Margaret Rose Trask, for no one in particular but because it was a name that felt right when you said it, and she became Maggie within a week and never got called Margaret except in circumstances of gravity. James received his sister with the focused wariness of a 4-year-old who was not yet sure what he thought about sharing the general attention, and then, after several days of assessment, decided she was acceptable and became her fiercest champion, a position he maintained consistently thereafter. Benjamin held Maggie with the practiced ease of a man who had done this once before and was less frightened by it this time, which was to say he was only normally terrified rather than existentially so. He sat with both children in his lap in the evening and looked at Grace with an expression she had memorized by now in all its variations but still found new every time, the deep, unhurried fullness of it. "I want to build the house bigger," he said. "Another room at least. 2 if we can manage it before spring." "We can manage it," she said, because the books said so and the books did not lie. The addition was built in the fall, a proper bedroom for James, which freed up the back room as Maggie's and gave Grace a room she could use as an office, with a proper desk and a shelf for the ledgers and the reference books she had accumulated, a whole small working world of her own. She sat in it the first evening it was complete and looked at the shelves and the desk and the window that looked out toward the eastern pasture, the boundary that had been fought over and won, and felt the full particular weight of having built something. She thought about her father. She thought about the letter he had written to a man named Harlan Webb who was already gone. She thought about what he would have thought of this house, this land, this life, these children, this man. She thought he would have been relieved and proud, and perhaps a little bewildered by the distance between what he had arranged and what had actually come to pass. She thought he had done, in his diminished and uncertain way, the best he could for her. She thought the misdirection, the wrong ranch in the dark, the unfamiliar name, had been the exact right accident if accidents could be right. She thought that they could. The years continued to arrive and unfold with the particular rhythm of ranch life, which was not slow but was structured, anchored to seasons, and the calendar of cattle work in a way that gave time a shape and a texture. James grew from toddler to small boy to a child who could ride with real confidence, and who had his father's instinct for the land and his mother's instinct for numbers, which was a combination that made Benjamin say privately to Grace that the ranch was in good hands for the generation after them. Maggie grew from baby to small girl with an extraordinary quality of attention, a child who watched everything that happened around her with the focused interest of a scholar, noting things down in her small, precise way, and then producing them later in conversation with a timing that was frequently startling. She had her mother's love of books and her father's love of the land in roughly equal measure, and had not yet decided which she would let win, a decision she appeared to regard as something she had time for. There was a third pregnancy, 4 years after Maggie. This one arrived in the February of 1885, when the winter was sharp and the nights long, a second boy, dark-eyed like his father and red-faced and furious like himself. They named him William Thomas Trask, and he became Will within hours and kept it, and he was the loudest of the 3 children and the most immediately charming, and the one most likely to have eaten something inadvisable by the time anyone noticed he had gone quiet. Benjamin, who had at the birth of his first child looked at Grace with an expression of almost overwhelming feeling, and at the second with deep and grounded joy, looked at his third son with an expression she could only describe as completed, as though this specific configuration of a family was the one that had been building toward itself all along. Mrs. Arrieta had been coming and going for years, but had, after the birth of James, begun to stay longer and longer each season, until by the time Will arrived she was effectively a permanent presence, with her own room off the kitchen, and a standing in the household that was not that of an employee, but of a person who belonged there. She and Grace had developed a friendship that operated on its own terms, built on the easy shorthand of 2 women who ran a large enterprise together, who respected each other's competence, and had come to love each other in the practical and fierce way of people who depend on each other for important things. Domingo had stayed too. He had talked about leaving occasionally over the years, the way a man does when he is young and the world presents its possibilities, but the double crown kept giving him reason to stay, and he had made his peace with the fact that this was home, which was its own kind of resolution. Pete retired in 1884. He had been at the ranch longer than anyone except the land itself, and his retirement was marked by a supper that he bore with visible if gratified discomfort, and a speech from Benjamin that was 3 sentences long, and said everything that needed to be said. He went to live with his daughter's family in Amarillo, and Benjamin rode into town to see him twice a year, and the 2 men sat on the daughter's porch, and said nothing of significance for hours, which was their deepest form of communication. His replacement was a young man named Caleb Torres, who came recommended by Domingo, and proved to be one of those people who makes every operation around them more efficient simply by being the kind of person they are, reliable and knowledgeable, and with a dry humor that worked well in the particular key of Double Crown Ranch humor, which was spare and often arrived several minutes after the thing that had prompted it. The Texas Panhandle was changing steadily around them. The railroads had come in and changed the cattle trade. Towns had grown up where there had been emptiness. The open range was largely a memory. Benjamin had adapted at every turn, which was not always comfortable but was consistently correct, and the Double Crown was, by 1885, a model operation in its county, known for good cattle and honest dealing and a rancher's wife who could produce a legal brief that would make a lawyer uncomfortable. That reputation had actually brought Grace occasional paid work over the years, neighbors who needed contracts reviewed or accounts set in order, and who had heard about what she had done with the Harker boundary case. She had done 3 such jobs over 4 years, always on her own time and at fair rates, and the money went into a separate account she was building for the children's education. In the late summer of 1885, a letter arrived from a law firm in Amarillo. It was addressed to Mrs. Grace Trask, and it inquired, with professional formality, whether she would be interested in a position as a paralegal assistant, as the firm had need of someone with her documented skills, and her reputation suggested she was the right person. The letter had been prompted, it emerged, by Harker's former lawyer, of all people, who had been on the losing side of the boundary case and had admired the opposing documentation enough to mention it to colleagues. She sat with that letter for 2 evenings before she brought it to Benjamin. He read it and handed it back to her. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I do not want to move to Amarillo," she said. "The children are here and this is home, and I do not want any of that to change." "Those are not the only options," he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Amarillo is 60 miles away and we have a good wagon road and I am capable of managing the children for several days at a stretch," he said. "I mean that there might be a way to do this work from here on your terms." "You would be comfortable with that," she said. "With me going to Amarillo periodically, with the things that would need to shift around." "Grace," he said, with the patient directness that was fundamentally his. "You have run this ranch's books for 6 years. You have raised 3 children. You managed the legal campaign that secured this ranch's eastern boundary. You have more capability than any position you have held has fully used. If there is work that uses more of it, I want you to have that work. Whatever we need to move around to make it possible, we move." She looked at him for a long moment, feeling the full weight of being known by someone, the particular gift of it, the way it held you up. "You are the most remarkable man I have ever encountered," she said. "You told me once that having useful skills is not the same as remarkable," he said. "I agreed with you then. I am less sure now." She wrote to the law firm. She negotiated a terms arrangement, 3 days in Amarillo per month, work transmitted by post between those visits, a trial period of 6 months with an honest assessment at the end. The firm agreed. It was not the whole of what they had offered, but it was the shape of it that fit the life she had, and the life she had was the life she wanted. The first Amarillo trip was in October, and she was gone 3 days and came back with a case file that took up half the desk in her office, and a lit-up quality in her face that Benjamin had not seen quite in that specific way before. The look of a mind that had been given a larger problem to work on, and had found it fully engaging. He put a cup of coffee in front of her, and she barely noticed because she was already reading, and he stood in the doorway of her office watching her for a moment and smiled. The children received the new arrangement with varying degrees of response. James, at 6, was deeply interested in the concept of his mother going to a city to do legal work, which aligned with his understanding that his mother was an important person, a belief he held with the uncomplicated conviction of a child who had simply observed it to be true. Maggie, at 3, was displeased by the absences, and expressed this clearly but adjusted within about 2 months to the rhythm of it. Will, at 8 months, had no opinions beyond the immediate and pressing. The 6-month trial became a permanent arrangement. Grace Trask spent 3 days a month in Amarillo, working on contract documentation and records management for a growing firm in a growing city, and she spent the rest of the month at the Double Crown, which was home in every meaning of the word. And she ran the house and the books and the garden, and raised 3 children who were growing into people she genuinely admired. She sat on the porch one evening in October of 1886, a year after the law firm arrangement had begun, watching the sun go down over the grassland. The sky was doing what the sky in Texas did, painting itself in colors too vivid to be believed, red and gold, and a deep burning orange that ate the horizon and left the grassland below it looking like something out of a story. James was in the barn with Benjamin, learning to mend a bridle. Maggie was inside with Mrs. Arrieta, learning to make tortillas with a focused determination that Mrs. Arrieta was meeting with equal focus. Will was asleep. Benjamin came out of the barn and crossed the yard and came up the porch steps and sat down beside her in the other chair. He was dusty from the day and his hat was pushed back on his head and he had a small cut on his right hand from the bridal work that he had tied a rag around. They sat together and watched the sky. 8 years, he said. Almost exactly, she said. October the 14th, 1878. You were soaked through and your horse was about done, he said. You knocked on my door and asked for a man who had not been here in years. And you said I could stay, she said. I meant longer than one night, he said. I think I knew that when I said it. I just did not know the full extent of what I meant. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky, his profile in the last of the sun's light, the face she knew better than any other face in the world, the lines of it that she had been watching change and deepen for 8 years. Are you glad, she asked, of all of it, the way it has gone? He turned from the sky and looked at her with that expression she had first seen at Christmas in the first year and had been seeing ever since, the one that was the full of him with nothing held back. Every single day, he said. Not in spite of how it happened, because of how it happened, the storm, the wrong address, the name nobody recognized, all of it. I rode up to the wrong ranch, she said. And it was exactly the right one, he said. She reached over and took his hand, the one with the rag tied around it, and held it, and they sat together on that porch while the sky finished its extravagance, and the evening came in cool and quiet over the grassland and the lights in the house behind them came on one by one. Her children, her home, her life arranged around her with the solidity of things built to last. In the barn James was calling something to the horses in his father's even voice. Inside the house Maggie was laughing at something Mrs. Arrieta had said. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote made one long, ascending call into the coming dark. The Double Crown Ranch sat on its land under the enormous Texas sky, solid and real and worked for. And inside its walls and on its porch and in its kitchen and across its fields lived the life of 2 people who had found each other through an accident that was not an accident, through a wrong turn that was the only right turn, through a door knocked on in the dark that had opened onto everything. Grace Talbot had arrived at the wrong ranch with a name nobody recognized and no plan beyond surviving the night. Benjamin Trask had opened his door in a storm and said stay, and meant the whole of a life. And the whole of a life was precisely what they had built, out here on the edge of the known world, in the last long light of the wild frontier, in the years when the land was still finding its shape and so were the people on it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back and the October night settled around them, comfortable and certain, the way all the best things felt once you had finally stopped being afraid of them. James came out of the barn and saw them sitting together and walked across the yard in his small, deliberate way and climbed up between them and looked at the last color fading from the sky with the same focused attention he gave to everything. The horses are settled, he said. Good work, Benjamin said. James leaned against his father's arm and accepted this. He looked at his mother. Papa says the stars in Texas are the best stars anywhere, he said. He would know, Grace said. He has been watching them longer than either of us. But you have been watching them together, James said, with the logic of a 6-year-old who had identified the relevant variable, so you would know together. Benjamin and Grace looked at each other over their son's head, and the thing that passed between them in that look was the accumulated weight of 8 years and the lightness of a moment that held all of them, warm and entire. "Yes," Grace said. "Together." The stars came out over the double crown, as they did every night, as they had done before any of these people arrived and would do long after. But tonight they were watched by a family on a porch who had come to be where they were through a storm and a wrong address, and a door opened by a man with the generosity to say come in, the courage to say I love you, and the wisdom to build something worth staying for. And Grace Talbot Trask, who had arrived in the dark with a letter for a stranger and found something altogether different waiting for her, looked up at those stars and felt, as she had been learning to feel for 8 years, the deep and settled joy of a woman who had knocked on the right wrong door and had the extraordinary good sense to walk through it.